So, what sets us apart from the rest of creation? What makes the human mind different from other minds? Many people have thought about that, and there are many candidate answers, but one that's always attracted me is, very broadly, imagination. So, the capacity to recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual world that's created by a novel or an opera or a film, or the world created by a scientist to understand something about the beginning of the universe or the microscopically small. So I rather agree with Robin Dunbar, who's an anthropologist who wrote, "What sets us apart is a life in the mind, the ability to imagine." I should say very broadly to imagine, and I'll come back to that. But on that background, I was intrigued when, about 15 years ago, this referral letter arrived. I was working as a neurologist in Edinburgh, asking me to see someone who had lost the ability to visualize, having had it up till then. So, following a procedure, an angioplasty, he'd had a procedure on his heart, he's become aware of the fact that he's now unable to imagine anything. He notes this particularly at night, when he's never been a good sleeper, previously used to imagine things to help himself get off to sleep, now can't do so, can't picture his children or his grandchildren in his mind. Like the general practitioner, I hadn't come across anything like this before myself, and I therefore went to the literature, and I'll tell you a little about that later in the course of the talk. I'm going to introduce you to him in a moment. So this patient we've described as MX, and having told you about his case, I'll then tell you something about the surge of interest that followed, which led to our description of a phenomenon that up till then didn't have a name, aphantasia, the lifelong lack of a mind's eye. And then I'm going to take a little detour, tell you about the work that I've done with an interdisciplinary team, the Eyes Mind team, over the last few years, and then come back to aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and the future of this line of research. So let me introduce you to MX, who first introduced me to this subject.
Found it a personal visit just a few weeks after I had my angioplasty. I noticed at night when I went to bed that I couldn't do what I usually did, which was, before going to sleep, thinking about my family, my children, grandchildren, and picturing them. They just wouldn't come to mind. And also, I used to have a technique to go to sleep. Couldn't get to sleep, and that was to start at 99 and count backwards. But looking at the numbers, either black and white or white and black, and watch them in my mind's eye and click them off, and I never got down to one. I was asleep by then. So that was about 3 weeks after I had had the angioplasty.
Did you find that all visual imagery had disappeared? So were you able to visualize places which you'd visited, for example?
No, I couldn't visualize anything. I could remember them, but I couldn't visualize them.
And you don't think that the inability to visualize has had very much impact on your ability to remember?
As far as I can see, it hasn't had any effect at all. My memory is as good as it was, I think.
Even to remember visual details?
Yes, I know that sounds a bit odd. Even to remember visual details, which I can't see, but I can remember.
You just know?
I just know, but I can't see them. I can't explain that.
So as you see, he's a very articulate person who gave a very good account of his symptoms. He, at the same time as losing imagery, his dreams became avisual. So he said that he continued to have dreams, but they didn't have any visual content. He would dream a storyline. And he said that whereas previously when he read a novel, he would enter a visual world, that was no longer the case. And we found that he was really normal in all respects, other than that he scored right down at floor on the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, which gives you a measure of imagery vividness. Now, he also performed rather unexpectedly well on tests that are meant to assess visual imagery. So if I ask a question like, which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree, most people, the average person, will consult a visual image and compare the shades of those two items and come up with an answer. MX could answer those questions just fine. But he said, I can't see anything, I don't need to see anything, I just know. And that seemed quite plausible. So we thought the only way of discovering what had happened would probably be to look in his brain, so to speak. And we did a brain imaging study in which we asked him to look at faces and then to imagine faces. And when he looked at faces, his brain activation was completely normal, just like yours or mine. So let's see if I can use the arrow. I can't. The areas that you're seeing in the top scan are towards the back of the brain, top image on the right, towards the back of the brain, and they include areas which we know are important for recognizing faces, an area called the fusiform face area, which is strongly activated when you or I look at a face. And as you see, when MX looked at faces, his brain activation was just like that of controls, so other people of the same age and educational background as he. But when he tried to visualize a face, he failed to activate those areas, so the warm colors at the top are now showing you areas that he activated less strongly than others. So that we found a kind of neural correlate, if you like, for the change he described in his experience. He no longer seemed able to drive the visual areas of the brain in the way that most people do when they visualize. We described his case, and I didn't expect too much more to come of this, but the description was picked up by an American science journalist called Carl Zeman, who wrote an article in Discover, which I think is a kind of US equivalent of New Scientist, a popular science magazine here. And following Carl Zeman's description, over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I was contacted by about 20 people who said, it's strange, I'm just like the man described in this article, but I've always been that way. I've never been able to visualize. I've always been aware that there's something a little bit different about me. I lack a mind's eye. And we asked this group of 20 or so people to complete the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, which I think you're probably all familiar with. This is a questionnaire which asks you to contemplate the sun setting in a misty sky and rate the vividness of the resulting image from as vivid as real seeing at the top, 5 out of 5, to no image at all, just thinking about it, 1 over 5. And as you can see, these 20 people scored right down at floor, as you would expect, on this questionnaire. And it turned out that they told quite a consistent story. There was one oddity about them. Most of them were men, but then they were readers of Discover magazine, so they were a slightly biased sample from the beginning. They mostly noticed this difference in their teens or their 20s, quite often, for example, when reminiscing with friends or family, and they'd come to realize that other people, as they were describing last year's holiday, they seemed to be having a kind of visual experience, or something like a visual experience, which they never had done. Didn't, in most cases, make a huge emotional impact. They were kind of curious rather than dismayed by this. About half said that they thought this difference affected all their senses, so no mind's ear, no mind's fingertip, whereas the other half said that they could imagine in other modalities. So some people say that they can hear a symphony in their mind's ear, even though they can't see anything in their mind's eye. Really interestingly, we thought most of the people who got in touch with us said they dreamt visually. And we thought this was fascinating because it suggested that there was a dissociation between, and some important, interesting difference between dream imagery and wakeful imagery or deliberate imagery in wakefulness. About 2/3 of these folks said that their autobiographical memory was rather poor, so they're not quite as good as their friends and relations at recollecting the detail of past events. And then they said that as a group they had verbal, analytical, mathematical strengths, but again we were aware that these were all readers of Discover magazine, so they would, wouldn't they? But we nevertheless thought that was interesting. And then we asked a question which turned out to be quite telling, suggested by my colleague Sergio Dalla Sala. He said, why not ask people to, in their heads, walk around their house counting the number of windows, house or apartment, counting the number of windows. And very interestingly, everyone in this group could do that, and they seemed to come up with the right answer, but they gave interesting descriptions of how they did it. It seemed not to be an entirely visual experience. So 5 windows, I remember them, but I don't see them. My thought is intentional and object-orientated, and I consider the windows to be in mind. Or I sort of fly through the house and inspect every room if the idea of a window is present and where. It's definitely not an image. It's more like understanding the idea of a window being there. I know it's there. So kind of a different way of consulting some sort of schema of the apartment or the house without actually being able to see it in your mind's eye. So the next question was, were we the first people to describe this? And I should say we weren't. Everything has a longer history than one thinks, but we were the first people to coin the term. So I haven't mentioned this. As these 20 folk got in touch, we thought that this phenomenon needed a convenient description, because up till then, the descriptions in the literature were very unwieldy, things like visual irreminiscence or defective revisualization. So I chatted to a friend who'd studied classics at university, and he said, why don't you borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, phantasia, and tag an A on the end, as in aphasia for difficulty with language. So that was how aphantasia was born, if you like, but how the term was born. But having encountered this interesting group of folk, we wondered, well, has it been described before? And it turns out that it had. So Francis Galton was a formidable 19th century Victorian psychologist, and he's always described as a polymath. He was one of the first people to introduce statistics to psychology, and he was the first person to try to measure the vividness of imagery, and he did this using a breakfast table questionnaire. So it's a very nice sort of Victorian approach. He says, visualize your breakfast table as you left it this morning, and you're then asked to rate the definition and colouring and vividness of the items on the table. And he noticed that, as he put it, there were some people who reported that their powers of visualization were zero. So he noticed that there were some folk who seemed not to do this thing. But there's been very little attention paid to that since. There has been some interest in a medical context. And it's interesting that all this happened in the 1880s, and then kind of the story died in a way. Cotard was a French psychiatrist working in Paris in the 1880s, and he felt that loss of the mind's eye was an important part of some psychological disorders, so depression in particular. And there is evidence indeed that depression can dim the vividness of imagery in people who previously had normally vivid imagery. And then Charcot, who's the great father of French neurology, had a patient who had abruptly lost the ability to visualize, probably because of a stroke. So Galton recognized that imagery, the mind's eye, might be absent throughout life. And Cotard and Charcot described loss of visualization occurring as a result of a psychological or a neurological disorder. And then it's not true to say there's been no attention paid to it since Galton. There has been just little work. So Bill Four is a US psychologist who is himself, as he described it, a wakeful non-imager. And he gave vividness questionnaire to a lot of undergraduates and came up with a figure of 2 to 3% for the frequency of what we have called aphantasia. I think he's just about the only psychologist who focused on this. But people working in a couple of related areas became interested in imagery. So people working with prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize faces, which sometimes runs in families, noticed that folk with prosopagnosia seem to have rather faint imagery. So just a hint that there might be some connection between face recognition and visual imagery. And people working with synesthesia, so that's the merging of the senses, people who will always see the letter P in crimson, had noticed that the folk they were working with seemed to have rather vivid imagery. So a couple of interesting, intriguing associations there. So that's where we had got to in around 2015. And at about that time, I had the opportunity to assemble a small team with which I've been working ever since, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And you will hear from all of us over the course of the weekend. As you can see, we're very glamorous. This is our... John O'Nyans, who's an art historian, Fiona McPherson, a philosopher, Susan Aldworth, an artist, Crawford, a neuroscientist, and Matthew, who's the postdoc working on the project. And I'll just tell you a little about what we've done before coming back to the theme of aphantasia and hyperphantasia. So first of all, we thought it would be interesting to find out what people had thought about imagery over history. We often neglect historical thinking. And part of the reason for this was just the thought that the history of a subject is the subject. If you're studying something, you really ought to know what people have thought in the past. But we also felt that as science has been learning so much about imagery in the last century, it would be interesting to look back at what people have thought previously, to frame the old in the light of the new, but also to ask whether philosophers who thought about this in the past maybe have posed questions which we should be trying to answer. And as we read, it occurred to us that these historical thinkers seemed to line up in a rather interesting way in two teams, rather distinct teams. So here's Plato, who says the philosopher uses no objective sense, but only pure ideas moving on through ideas to ideas and ending with ideas. So he had a low opinion of images. He thought that the real world was just a shadow of the truly real world, and so an image is a kind of shadow of a shadow, if you like, whereas Aristotle wrote, the soul, in fact, never thinks without a phantasma. So Aristotle thought that imagery was crucial to thought, whereas Plato rather denigrated it. And then here is a medieval philosopher, Thomas Aquinas. And it's interesting how confidently these philosophers write, I think making the assumption that their experience is everyone's experience. So he says, everyone can experience within oneself that when one tries to understand something, one forms certain phantasms for oneself by way of examples, in which one examines, as it were, the thing one is striving to understand. And so it is that when we wish to make someone else understand a thing, we propose examples to him through which he can form phantasms for himself in order to understand. So when you explain something, you sort of hand your phantasm onto the person you're talking to. And David Hume was clearly also someone who enjoyed very vivid imagery. When I shut my eyes and I think of my study, the ideas I form are exact representations of the impressions I felt when I was in my study. Every detail in one is to be found in the other. Whereas the psychologist Watson seems to have a less friendly relationship with imagery. When a person closes his eyes and says, I see the house where I was born, the trundle bed in my mother's room where I used to sleep, I can even see my mother as she comes to tuck me in, that person is merely dramatizing. The behaviorist finds no proof of imagery in all this. We have put all these things in words long, long ago. Or here is Wittgenstein. Suppose that someone were to draw while he had an image, or instead of having it, though it were only with his finger in the air, he could be asked, what does that represent? And his answer would be decisive. It is quite as if he'd given a verbal description, and such a description can simply take the place of the image. So imagery doesn't offer anything over words. And then in the course of the last century, there was a big argument between two schools in psychology, one led by Zenon Pilishin. Mental imagery should be understood to consist in abstract mental structures to which we do not have conscious access and which are essentially conceptual and propositional rather than pictorial in nature. So he's saying mental imagery essentially consists simply in facts which are dressed up somehow to give the impression that they're different, but they're not. Whereas Stephen Coslin said, imagery relies on representations that depict information, not describe it. So he thought that imagery provides a different way of thinking, a different mode of thought, perhaps a different mode of brain operation. So interesting that there are these two football teams, if you like, with very different takes on imagery. And in fact, somebody in Stephen Coslin's team thought it would be interesting to find out what the psychologists involved in the imagery debate, what kind of imagery experience the psychologists involved in the imagery debate had. And it turned out that the psychologists who had very faint imagery were on the Pilishin side, and psychologists with the vivid imagery were on the Coslin side. So this work was done by Matthew, who you will have or will soon meet, and was written up in this paper. I'm going to say very little about the next project because Crawford is giving a talk about this later in the weekend, but the second strand of work was to try to pull together what is known about what happens in the brain when we visualize. And Crawford has now published a paper on this, which is very beautifully illustrated using state-of-the-art methods for localizing activity in the brain. And I'll just show you a little fly-through that Crawford produced some time ago, which gives a kind of impression of the network of regions in the brain that's involved when we visualize. So it's clearly it's not a single region, it's not the whole brain, there's an interconnected network of regions involved in the process of visualization. And you'll hear more about that from Crawford tomorrow, I think. And then relatedly, we did another piece of work with Exeter undergraduates, Exeter students. So we collected a group of students who had rather faint imagery and a group who had rather vivid imagery, and we looked to see whether there was any difference in brain activation when they were visualizing. And as you see, the people who are rather faint visualizers, the low group, seem to activate more brain than the high visualizers, and vice versa, which actually fits in with observations in a number of other contexts. Essentially, if you're very good at something, you tend to do it efficiently and use rather little brain. And if you find something more difficult, you tend to use rather more brain and presumably work less efficiently. So that wasn't an entirely unexpected finding. We also looked at how activity in the brain changes as images become more vivid. So these are regions of the brain in which activity increases as the vividness of an image increases, and these are areas in which activity increases as the vividness decreases. And there isn't time to talk about them in detail, but essentially it's interesting that many of the areas in which activity increases as vividness increases are at the back of the brain, which on the whole has a lot to do with vision, whereas many of the areas where activity increases as vividness decreases are at the front of the brain, which has to do with organizing our thinking, controlling our thought. So it makes sense, really, that if you're finding something difficult, you're going to be working harder at it and therefore activating those thinking areas more strongly than you would otherwise. And now I'll come back to the third strand of the project's work, which had to do with putting together a register of people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia and learning more about them. So, to my surprise again, just coining the term aphantasia attracted a lot of publicity, which was great for the project. And it's the reason you're here, I suspect. So there were quite a lot of news stories, and people began getting in touch. In fact, I remember in 2015 sitting in front of my laptop and seeing the inbox fill up as I watched. It was very, very extraordinary. So nice that people are pleased to have a description, and indeed some people seem very pleased. So the greatest mystery of my life explained. First time I'd heard the word, I cried when I read it. I'd always thought there was something a bit wrong with me. I feel like my mind has been blown. So I think it turned out that there was quite a large community of people who had been aware that there was something a little bit different about them, but hadn't really found it easy to describe this, and were therefore pleased to have a term. And then the second observation from this mailbox, and I should say the way we responded to the mails, again, most of you will know this, was to send out questionnaires. So a vividness questionnaire, the VVIQ, and then a questionnaire asking a number of sort of common sense questions like, do you dream visually? And the results I'm showing you now are based on questionnaire data from 2,000 people with aphantasia, 200 with hyperphantasia, and the results that I'm showing you are statistically significant, as Fraser, sitting up the back there, has told me. So, about a third of folk with aphantasia describe difficulty in recognizing faces. You'll remember that there was a hint of that from previous work. So I don't know how many of you will have difficulty with Obama or Kate or Boris Johnson. Actually, I found the Obama decision quite hard. But people with prosopagnosia find it difficult to pick out the correct face, and a third of folk with aphantasia are describing that kind of problem. Another third say that they have real trouble recollecting individual events from the past. And around the time that we described aphantasia, Brian Levine, who's a Canadian memory researcher, described the severely deficient autobiographical memory syndrome. This is a syndrome in which people who are otherwise psychologically entirely normal have very thin recollection of events from their past. And Brian Levine wondered whether this is the same as aphantasia. I don't think it is, but I think there's some overlap. And it makes sense there should be some overlap because the areas involved in remembering your past overlap with the areas involved in visualizing, though they are also somewhat different. Then, we didn't ask about this specifically, and so I don't really have a clear sense of how frequently it occurs, but certainly quite a few people have been in touch have said they have Asperger's. So I think there is another area of overlap with autistic spectrum disorder, and this wouldn't be too surprising because autistic spectrum disorder has traditionally been associated with a deficit in imagination. Many people who got in touch said they really don't enjoy fiction, particularly not descriptive passages in novels. So the figures in this boat were those of a strong man with ragged grizzled hair and a sunbrowned face, and a dark girl of 19 or 20, sufficiently like him to be recognisable as his daughter. The girl rowed, pulling a pair of sculls very easily. The average reader, I think, just begins to form a sort of hazy image of these two in their boat while reading that. But somebody with aphantasia will not do, and therefore lengthy passages of descriptive prose often leave people cold as a result. Many people with aphantasia, and indeed aphantasia, have said that first they have first-degree relatives who are like them. And in fact, one of the first people to get in touch was this chap, who some of you will recognise, I guess, Craig Venter, who was the first person to decode the human genome. And he said that he'd always thought that one of the sources of the clarity of his scientific mind was that it wasn't cluttered with images. Francis Galton, working in the 19th century, noticed that many of the scientists he surveyed seemed to have rather weak imagery. The great majority of people who got in touch said that their aphantasia was lifelong, but there is a small number of people who lose imagery for physical reasons, so a stroke or a head injury or meningitis. This story was interesting. This lady woke up in the Czech Republic and noticed that she couldn't visualize. I don't know how she came to notice this, but I imagine she's one of those people who gets herself to sleep by visualizing. She was really bothered by this, so she Googled it. She found aphantasia. She drove herself to a local hospital and said, "I have acute aphantasia and I need a scan." And her scan showed a small stroke, acute stroke in the parietal lobe, in a region which could plausibly be involved in imagery. And then, just as anticipated by Kotar in the 19th century, there are situations in which people lose imagery for psychological reasons. So depression, depersonalization, derealization syndrome, anxiety are sometimes associated with a dimming of imagery. And then there was a big surprise in the postbag, which was that quite a lot of aphantasic artists and authors got in touch. I really hadn't expected there to be aphantasic artists. I think everyone in the team had rather naively assumed that if you didn't have visual imagery, you probably wouldn't be that interested in the visual world. But that turns out to be entirely false. And that is the genesis of the exhibition, which we'll go and visit this evening, which shows art both by artists, aphantasic and hyperphantasic artists. So there does, although that is the case, there does nevertheless seem to be some bias towards scientific, IT-related professions among people with aphantasia, and some bias towards more creative traits among people with hyperphantasia. But there are clearly many exceptions to that rule, as illustrated by the exhibition. And here is some work by aphantasic artists. The image in the middle you'll see when you go to the exhibition, and here is the opening in Glasgow. The exhibition had a run in Glasgow before coming down here. The survey also touched the question of dreaming. So we wanted to follow up the original observation that quite a number of people with aphantasia seem to dream visually, and indeed this turns out to be the case. So about a half of the 2,000 aphantasic people in our questionnaire survey dream visually. Now this strikes some people as very strange and rather fishy. How could it be that you don't have images by day, but you do have them by night? That doesn't make sense. But I think actually neurologically it does make sense, because what is happening in the brain neurochemically is very different in wakefulness and in sleep. And to sort of caricature, if I ask you to imagine an apple or visualize your front door here and now, you have to do something very rational. You have to understand the words I'm using. You have to make a decision to use your mind in that way. It's a very top-down process involving the frontoparietal cortices, whereas dreams are completely different. They're driven by activity in the brainstem. They're much more of a bottom-up process. So I think I haven't really explained these slides, but they are showing that the chemistry and the regional activity of the brain are very different in dream sleep from wakefulness. So I think neurologically it isn't that surprising that wakeful and dreaming imagery should come apart. And then we were also interested in finding out whether aphantasia affects all senses or just some senses. And it turns out that in our much larger sample, it's again a roughly 50-50 split. So about half the folk with aphantasia who've been in touch say that they really don't think they have imagery in any modality, whereas others say that they do have imagery in some other modality. So here's Oliver Sacks, who got in touch quite early on. He was aphantasic, he had no visual imagery, but he could hear music in his mind's ear. He loved music, wrote about it. He didn't have a particularly strong mind's ear, but he could hear music to some degree. Whereas Blake Ross, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, who wrote a very entertaining Facebook post, which I'm sure some of you will have read, says that he has no imagery in any modality, whatever. So you might say, well, it seems to come in so many different flavours, I wonder whether it's anything real at all. And I would answer to that if you have a capacity that depends on a network of distributed brain regions, you would expect that it could vary in more than one way. And I don't think aphantasia is a thing. I think it's a thing in a sense. I think it's a real phenomenon. I think people with aphantasia have a different experience, but I think it can arise in a number of different contexts. So, having had this big, unexpectedly big postbag, we wondered why people were so interested. Why does it touch a chord? And I think it is because representing things in their absence, imagining things, is such a kind of important human act. We spend a lot of our time thinking about what happened in the past, anticipating the future, and so forth. And we tend to do it with those who are close to us. And for most of us, but not all, visualization is a rather key component of recollection and anticipation. It's clearly not crucial to it, but it's quite a key component. And if aphantasia really affects 2% of the population, that's a lot of people, and those 2% will be pleased that some light is being shone on this, and the other 90% will be interested that there's a group of people whose experience is so different. People have said lovely things about their experience, very illuminating. Here are just three. You can read them for yourselves. Okay, so I'm going to mix up sort of conclusions, questions, and next steps. So, do imagery extremes exist? I think there are still some people who might be skeptical about it and wonder whether there's anything to this. So, I'm sure they do, but I think there is more work to be done to kind of prove it and to understand it. So I'll say a little more about how one might go about proving it. Is aphantasia a disorder? I don't really think that's the right way to think of it. I think it's more of a mouthful, but I think it's an intriguing variation in human experience. Like synesthesia. You wouldn't say that somebody with synesthesia had anything wrong with them. They just have an interestingly different kind of experience. And my guess is that there are advantages and disadvantages to having dim imagery and advantages and disadvantages to having vivid imagery, and indeed that's the next question, and that's something that we'll have a lot of opportunity to discuss this weekend, and I think probably the best opportunity that there's ever been to think about what are the pros and cons of being at one or other end of the spectrum. Good occasionally to be able to prove that the philosopher was wrong. I think we can conclusively say that the soul can think without a phantasm. Many of you have proved that. And thinking about aphantasia, I think, makes it clear that visualization simply is not the same as imagination. You can be highly imaginative without having visual imagery. Imagination is a much broader capacity, and the exhibition that you'll be visiting helps to demonstrate that. So where do we go next? Well, I think what I've been telling you about so far is data gathered from using a questionnaire. It's first-person evidence. It's scientifically a little bit suspect. It's introspective. So we need to, as people say, triangulate. We need to get some more objective data, make some measurements. And we've just finished doing a study in which we recruited 24 people with aphantasia, 20 in the middle and 25 at the high end, and gave some neuropsychological tests, so for tests that we thought might be relevant. So, for example, of autobiographical memory or face recognition. And we've done some brain imaging. And we've been assisted in this by the existence of a control sample in, well, I should say a population sample in Exeter. So the Exeter 10,000 is a group of people who agreed to take part in research projects, and we sent to all the people in the Exeter 10,000 who were on email the VVIQ and produced this nice distribution. So people with aphantasia down at the low end, I think 0.7% score 16, which is the very lowest score. So we've recruited our average sample from this group. And this is really hot off the press. So if you photograph it, please don't show it to too many people. It may be quite wrong, but this is just happened to come through yesterday. So this is the difference in brain activity when imagining between people with hyperphantasia and aphantasia. So it does look as if there are going to be some detectable differences in brain activity between people who have described hyperphantasia and those who describe aphantasia, whereas there was no difference in brain activity when these folk were just looking, which is what you would hope to find. So there should be more news on that theme before long. We're doing a bit of genetics because we think that first-degree relatives are being described more often than you'd expect by chance, so it would be nice to find some genes for visual imagery. We have a PhD student, Catherine, somewhere about, who's back there, who's looking at working memory in aphantasia. So this is sort of very short-term memory, the kind of memory you use when you're holding information in mind. She wants to know whether that's affected. And we've got a big job to do, just making sense of what we already have. And maybe there'll be a chance over the course of the weekend to come back to that. Our sort of wish list for the future, which I very much hope this conference will influence and inform. Okay, so I told you about a single case, somebody who lost the ability to visualize, the process by which we revisited Galton's work and rediscovered that there's quite a large group of people who have a lifelong lack of imagery. I've told you a little about the Eyes Mind project, the work showing that it looks as if the thinking of the great philosophers of the past about visual imagery might have been influenced by their own imagery vividness. Crawford's work looking at brain areas which are activated when we visualize, and then something about the psychological significance of imagery extremes. I was very pleased when this arrived. So this is a dinosaur cartoon about aphantasia. Close your eyes and picture it. It's a sunny day, but you're in the pleasant shade of a large tree. Are you seeing it right now? Because if not, you may have aphantasia. People with aphantasia don't see things when they imagine them. They can think of things, obviously, but summoning up a lifelike image, something real or imaginary, it doesn't happen for them. And the most amazing part is that they don't even realize they have aphantasia, because they've always assumed phrases like "picture it in your mind's eye" are purely metaphorical. What does it mean if you're aphantasical? Nothing really. It doesn't really impact your life, except when you find out when you have it, and then you're like, wait, other people can actually see things when they close their eyes, and we all act like this is normal. Beyond that, it's all good. Not just with eyes closed, you can also imagine things with your eyes open. So this research began in Edinburgh with my colleagues Sergio Della Sala and Misha Dura, and then moved down to Exeter, and has very much depended on my collaborators in the Eyes Mind team, but also colleagues here, Fraser Milton and John Fulford, and a very keen team of students, Britt and James and Mada and Keelan. Many of you will have heard from some of these, and then little Rory appeared on the scene during the course of this work to join in. And if you want to know more and haven't already, please visit the Eyes Mind website. Thanks very much. So, I think we've got a few minutes for questions before we move on to Joel's talk.
Is there anything that can be done to improve this situation?
That's the question that I've been asked most often, that I find most difficult to answer, I think. I'd be very surprised if imagery can't be enhanced to some degree, because just about everything we do can be improved with practice. But most people with aphantasia who've been in touch about this, who have tried to kind of cultivate imagery seem to have failed. So my impression is that there probably is some obstacle, possibly some biological limitation. But I wouldn't, never say never. Joel may want to say something about that in his talk, because he's used some brain stimulation technique to modulate imagery to make it more vivid, though I think not in people with aphantasia, but in people who have some degree of imagery. So it's a great question. It's very much on the agenda. Don't have an answer at the moment.
Two questions. One's about, have you thought of trauma-based aphantasia?
Do you mean psychological or physical?
Being there, like PTSD.
Yeah. So, again, that's a question that quite a lot of people have brought up. So might it be that if something very traumatic happens and you really can't bear to imagine what happened, maybe you close down imagery? I think that's a possibility. It needs to be, I guess, looked at more closely in individual cases. I think most of the lifelong folk with lifelong aphantasia who have been in touch haven't described any particular trauma in the past. So I don't think it's the general explanation, but it might well be relevant in some cases. We have a workshop tomorrow which is going to be run by Nili, and I think that would be a great, sitting up behind you, that'd be a great topic for focusing on them.
And the other one is a speech sensors 5, when you actually work in aphantasic, so trying to imagine faces or images.
So there is a bit of activity in language-related areas in the sort of left inferior frontal cortex. I guess that one complication is that most tasks probably use language to kick things off. So it's a little bit difficult to know to what extent you're just seeing a reflection of the instruction in the brain activity and to what extent it's an intrinsic part of the imagery process.
I have a few questions. I took it on the train. Yeah, funny enough, I met somebody that has this condition sitting next to me on the train up here.
Right.
Which was quite amazing, really. She's a nurse. Going back to not really linked to the post-traumatic stress disorder. I said, so we see a really gory scene then in the operating theatre. I go, you're completely fine with it. Do you have any flashbacks? She goes, yeah, it's great. That's quite random.
Yeah.
But my question is how does this interact with people when they have a psychotic episode, or they go toad licking in the jungle or take LSD? Do people with aphantasia, are they able to have visual hallucinations? Does that come from the dream part of the brain or from this visual imagery part of the brain?
So on the first count, just your aside at the beginning, that is interesting. So quite a lot of people with aphantasia have said that they think they are a bit less bothered by what for other people would be disgusting images, that they maybe get over upsetting events and images faster than they would otherwise. That's really, really interesting. A certain number of people have described what happens when they take psychedelic drugs, and that does often produce imagery, and it is seems to be more like dream imagery than it's like voluntary imagery, so not much control over it, and having had it doesn't seem to enable you to have imagery at will at other times.
Have you had any people in your sample that were either born blind or became blind later in life?
That's one of those other questions I hope that people won't ask, because I know there is a literature on imagery in congenitally blind people, which I don't really know my way around. I think the straight answer is we haven't. But I have encountered people, and there certainly are descriptions of people who go blind and nevertheless retain very vivid imagery. I think it can go. Oliver Sacks, in fact, has written about this quite a bit. I think it can go one of two ways. Some people cultivate and seem to retain really vivid imagery, and for other people it fades and disappears. I met a painter actually who was losing his sight, and he was very distressed by this and was really working hard at keeping imagery alive, because it had been such an important part of his life up till then. Though he was also beginning to do some sculpture as a kind of therapy for the loss of vision. Should we go to Nick and then?
Yeah. You probably pointed out, and I didn't really catch it, but the distinction between voluntary and involuntary waking imagery seems really important. And Sachs had or reporting having involuntary but not voluntary. You think about, pick his floating apart, that's what he's going to say. And that's the bit I don't understand. I can understand the logic of your description of dreams, but it's the distinction between waking voluntary and waking involuntary, and why some people would have waking involuntary and others wouldn't have any at all.
It's quite a subtle distinction, isn't it? But it's an interesting one.
To you, it's not very subtle to me.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I think so. The fact that many people with aphantasia say they don't like reading descriptive passages because they don't do anything for them, that suggests that that kind of involuntary imagery belongs with the voluntary sort. But then I don't know, but I wonder whether a sort of PTSD-like intrusive recollection might be more dreamlike involved, might be less.
I'm just trying to get the on the negative. I was baffled by the mechanisms I got through it.
I can't answer the question at the moment.
It's interesting you mentioned schema when they're talking about how many windows you've got in the house. Because me and my twin are both aphantasic, but we feel like there's an extra level as well. I've thought the schema myself. It's like we can't even imagine. It's like you go into the house or wherever, oh yeah, that's what's there. It's like a continual reliving. You look behind and then you look away and you look again. It seems like there's something extra fundamental, like for example, spatial awareness. It's like you can't create any space to the world.
Okay, so you couldn't do the counting windows task. Okay.
It's like we know that a house exists, but what that house is made up of.
Well, we have no idea what's out here. I don't know which way we came in. I don't know where our accommodation is.
Right.
I've lived in my house for 10 years and I don't know what the room above my kitchen is.
So sort of direct route finding problems have been mentioned by quite a lot of people, but not enough for me to be sure that it's truly a part of the, or at least often a part of the broader picture.
And also losing things. I lose things all the time. I put my phone down. Everything is just chaotic. So to say that it doesn't impact on your daily life, I find amazing because I've got an impact all the time. Even my journey here was impacted by aphantasia. And friends will say, well, I know where my purse is or my phone is because I have a vivid image of where I left it. And so
I think it certainly makes a difference to daily experience. And then, as I said, I think it can probably occur in different contexts with sort of different associated symptoms.
Yes, I'd like to follow through on what the last person said, which this thing about when you mentioned it doesn't really affect your life. When I first heard the term aphantasia, I thought, fantastic, now I understand. At school, everybody thought I was bright, but I couldn't learn because I had nothing, no visual to remember this. Learning has been hugely affected by life. Going to a yoga class, I have to see it maybe 50 times more than anybody to start to get any sense. And the only way I could do it is watching somebody else do it at the same time. I've never had a dream, I've never had any imagery, I don't think in any of my senses. I have very strong intuition. Now and that's just off the top of my head, it's like knowing without knowing, but I don't really know, I check it out. And that word know is a big word for me, because you just kind of know things, but you don't know how, because there's nothing to put it on. And one big thing I want to mention is, and I have written to you about this, people who could be wrongly diagnosed with dementia, because so much of dementia testing is based on looking at pictures, what's different in the My late husband died of dementia. Also, even with words, strings of words, repeat the words. I can just see if people, and most people still don't know about it, people would be wrongly diagnosed. I would be wrongly diagnosed with dementia, I know that.
Okay, that's very important. So if I said doesn't affect daily life, I shouldn't have done that. I don't think that's really what I meant. I think I meant something more like compatible with being very productive, creative, and indeed imaginative.
I need to take your radio mic.
Yes. I was going to say there are more questions, but I think we better move on